It's human nature to want to find something concrete to do to help after an attack like the one in Las Vegas. Almost immediately, people started lining up to donate blood for the hundreds hospitalized with injuries. Many are also looking to make financial donations. But with a lot of scam charities popping up, experts say you should triple check exactly where your money is going before you send it. And here in Massachusetts, all of this feels just a little bit too familiar. 4.5 years ago, it was our neighbors who were in need of donations after the marathon bombings when 3 people were killed and hundreds of others injured. It was thanks to our many world-renowned hospitals and the efforts of first responders that more people did not die that day. But what lessons were learned and how has emergency response changed since? Joining me are State Representative Harold Naughton of Clinton, who is chair of the Joint Committee for Public Safety and Homeland Security. Good to see you, Representative.
Good to see you, Chief.
And Dr. David King of Massachusetts General Hospital's Trauma Center, who ran the Boston Marathon in that year of 2013 and aided victims after the bombing. Doctor, it's good to see you again. Let me start with you, Representative, if I can. Obviously, the marathon bombing, as I said, almost 5 years ago. Boston received incredibly high marks. Have lessons from that experience, the aftermath, been learned in places like Las Vegas, or have they not?
I think it's too early to say whether or not Las Vegas learned any lessons, but we certainly learned
What
lessons.
did we learn?
Before that, the marathon that year, and traditionally, the emergency operations centers were not operating. They kicked into place about half an hour into the event, but it took time to get online, it took time to get the media apprised of what was going on, it took time to get all of the various stakeholders. At the end of the day, about 116 different federal, state, and local law enforcement and public safety agencies involved. If that had been in operation at the start of the marathon, or in preparation for the marathon, perhaps the response could have been somewhat quicker.
Have those things been addressed? Have they been fixed?
Both MEMA and FEMA have done extensive reports. Our own state agency, MEMA, did a 120-page after-action report post-marathon bombings, pointing out what happened right, much of it with our medical community, and pointing out what could have been done better.
You know, speaking of our medical community, everybody with whom I have spoken or read said how well we did. In part, the training, obviously. In part, we had, 6 level 1 trauma centers within a mile or two. I read today there's only 1 in the whole state of Nevada. That infrastructure was a huge part of our success, not to downplay at all what people like you and others did, was it not?
It was. We're exceptionally fortunate in Boston. The medical infrastructure and disaster planning in this city, it truly is a model for many cities. And that infrastructure, albeit imperfect by definition, worked on Marathon Monday, largely worked. And we learned lessons, and I'd like to think we learned those, we adopted and then changed and improved the way we respond to disasters, and we publish that in peer-reviewed medical literature, so this can be learned by everybody else.
When you say it can be learned by everybody else, Doctor, has it been learned by everybody else? I shouldn't have even asked the question that I asked the representative. Obviously, we have no idea, based in this immediate aftermath, what's going on in Las Vegas. But have other jurisdictions picked up on the best of what we did and listened to people like the representative about what needed fixing?
Yes, absolutely. There are
like what?
There are a variety of national level and even international level meetings where these kinds of disasters are debriefed in exceptional detail. And we look at, again, what we did right, things we could have done better, things that we have that other people don't have, things that we don't have that we should have. And that gets out to other municipalities.
I think the most recent example, if I can, either of you have a lesson or two from here that's been transferred to other jurisdictions.
Well, I think what you can look at here is most recently is Sail Boston, where we had Boston police on the ground, we had Navy divers in the water searching for any type of untoward activity, and we had the Coast Guard in the harbor and above us. And again, there was a joint operations center set up in the seaport between federal, state, and local officials. I think if you were to say to look to the New York Marathon and to other events like that around the country, they've learned from what we learned from Marathon Monday.
You both served in the military. You were a combat surgeon, correct? Are there lessons from those days that are transferable and should be. I mean, you're a big tourniquet guy, which to people like me, a layperson, sounds like, didn't I see that on Dr. Welby in the 1960s?
Yeah, so the military medical, not just military medical lessons, but the military lessons for dealing with mass casualty incidents have been so well described in the peer-reviewed medical literature. We take them for granted now. When cities and municipalities are doing disaster planning, and I don't mean medical disaster planning, not just how we move patients, but the entire preparation for, right? The idea of having pre-event intelligence about threats, and the idea about pre-positioning divers and helicopters and appropriate police presence on the ground before anything happens as a major act of prevention, but also to be able to respond adequately should something happen. These are all, in some part, largely military lessons that we have adopted in the civilian world, to say nothing of the medical response, which certainly our response in the global war on terror has driven how medical providers respond to these disasters.
That your view is that something as simple and I would argue primitive, but I don't mean that in a pejorative way, as tourniquets are not in wide enough use in situations like this?
You know, I as you know and have pointed out, I am a big fan of the tourniquet. It's a $27 device that can save your life. But I don't want to be focused too narrowly, but it serves as a good example of simple things that can be done and pushed out and adopted. No one in the United States should die a preventable cause of death from bleeding. And limb hemorrhage is stoppable by any person with a proper purpose-made tourniquet. I don't want to focus too much, but it's a single example of how we can do something that's concrete.
Exactly. Can we step back for a second? I mean, one of the things that I'm sure you deal with, and I would bet you do to agree too, they're the injuries that people can feel, but what we learned in Boston, at least people like I did that wasn't aware of it, the trauma that a community feels lingers for a long time, and those aren't noticeable kinds of injuries. What are we doing on that front? Are we doing anything?
On the post-traumatic stress front, I think we can learn a lot from the fact, and the doctor, I think, would agree with me. 1 in 3 returning veterans, of the 2.5 million that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, are suffering some level of post-traumatic stress.
What do we learn from that?
We learn that we tell them to talk. You know, I look back to my father's generation, World War II, never talked and carried scars with them their entire lives.
Watch Ken Burns, Lynn Novick's Vietnam series, and you're learning that in spades.
And I have seen...
Not just talk, but don't hide it. I mean, there used to be this culture in that generation of...
The stoicism.
If you even brought it up, that generation, I think, thought of this as like they were weak or they were missing a part or something. And I think we've largely in the military been able to dispel that and say, listen, these are real psychological injuries.
But I mean beyond that, beyond people standing on Boylston Street, or beyond people at that country concert in Las Vegas, it trickles out.
We've got resources, though, of that experience, the various programs that have been set up around the Commonwealth and around the country to utilize the experience of veterans who come back home, veterans in the classroom, veterans in trauma rooms, veterans in law enforcement departments, take their experiences on a broader basis into a community, because Las Vegas will suffer for a long time, and in many ways, Boston and eastern Massachusetts still suffers from almost our innocence that was pierced that day. This was a holy grail to us, the Boston Marathon.
Well,
I think we can use those
was pierced that day, just as Las Vegas's was overnight.
And Orlando's the year before.
Exactly, and I mean the list goes on. Those wounds are real, though, and they're not just connected to the physical wounds. They're connected to the people who are treating, the first responders who are on the scene, the police officers, the families of those responders. These are all people who can be affected.
Representative, it's good to see you.
Good to see you,
Thanks
Jim.
for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Dr.
Yes, sir.
Simon,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your time. Thank you, gentlemen, both.